Hey guys, Drifter here. Welcome to Overwatch In Depth. In today's episode, we're going to be reviewing Genji, the weeboo hero that everybody loves to hate because he is so difficult to deal with sometimes. The gameplay you're going to get to see is, of course, all Genji, but I did want to add a caveat that I don't play Genji as often. I usually prefer Soldier or Tracer for DPS, and I'm not Seagull. It's not going to be quite pro plays here, but it should be good enough to serve for the background while we talk about the stats of the character. His base health is 200, which is normal for DPS heroes. Most of the DPS heroes in the game have 200. That does put him a little bit on the squishier side, but is not abnormally so. His passive gives you some extra movement abilities that are quite nice. It allows for double jumps and for wall climbing. You can wall climb after either the first or the second double jump. However, touching the wall does not reset your double jumps, nor can you get a double wall climb without touching the ground first. You have to touch the ground to reset your jumps, and you have to touch the ground to reset your wall climb. So while it is very high mobility, probably the highest in the game overall if you include verticality and overall movement speed, it does have some limitations to keep you from just flying all over the place like Lucio. Another thing you should note is that his short sword melee damage is still just 30. All of the characters in the game deal 30 damage with melee, and even though he hits you with a sword, it's still 30 damage. I don't know how a sword deals the same amount of damage as Zarya's big man hands or Mei's fluffy glove, but that's just kind of how it works. Let's talk about the damage on his primary weapon, which is the shurikens. It can be fired in two forms, either a linear dash that throws 3 shurikens in a row, or what I will call the fan attack, where he spreads 3 of them out horizontally and they kind of go out in a triangular or conical pattern. Each one of these shurikens will deal 28 damage per shuriken or ninja star, and they can get headshots for double damage, meaning that each burst of 3 is approximately 75 damage or 150 if you get headshots. That'll kill Tracer in one hit, but pretty much nobody else. The linear shurikens throw at a rate of 1 throw per second, and that's 3 at a time, so the combined overall rate of fire is 180 RPM. A little bit on the slow side on average, but Genji isn't really about his linear shurikens. The fan shurikens, or the 3-way spread, is much more common and popular because it has the same damage as the linear one, but it has slightly less time between throws, so you get a slightly higher overall rate of fire or DPS out of it. The shuriken projectile speed is pretty fast. I think it's 47 meters per second. You don't need to lead it very much except at long range. For close range and for closer to medium, I would probably say 0 leading is fine. It shouldn't drift very much unless you're trying to hit an extremely fast target like Tracer or something. And the difference between the two is situational. If you're looking at a target that's very long range or they're sitting stationary and haven't noticed you, use the linear throw. The linear throw is great for getting 3 headshots in a row. It's great for getting poke damage and harassing them at long range. It doesn't often finish people off though. However, if the enemy is very close range or if they're very hard to hit, use the fan throw, because with a close range enemy you're almost guaranteed to hit 2 out of the 3, or if it's somebody that's very agile like a Tracer or another Genji, or somebody that's running around a lot like a Pharah up in the air, you can use the fan to get some guaranteed hits, get some damage on them. Also, most of the time I recommend the fan throw anytime they're weak to get the finishing blow. Very, very effective that way, and that's what you see most Genjis doing, is getting in very close range and putting 3 shurikens in your face with each little dash. It'll chunk your health much faster than you think. While it can be nice, I find that shuriken attacks are less reliable and deal less damage overall than most DPS primaries. They are projectiles, so people do walk out of the way of them, and I don't know if you guys have this experience, but I feel like people walk in between my fan shurikens all the time, or I just barely miss them with the linear ones. Not the greatest overall attack, but it's just one part of a kit that is ultimately overloaded. Definitely the weakest part of his kit is this primary attack. The Swift Strike, or Sword Dash, which would be Shift on PC, will deal 50 damage per strike and has a pretty surprising distance of 14 meters. That's the total distance you can cover if you don't hit the ground or wall or anything like that, which means that 4 strikes can kill a DPS, or if you see somebody with a quarter health, most of the time 1 Swift Strike will kill them. It damages all targets in the path, not just the first target, so if there's a big group or 3 or 4 people, you can dash through and deal 150 or 400 or 200 damage depending on how many you hit. And the cooldown's actually pretty low at 8 seconds. It doesn't have a significant cooldown, but none of that is really really the cool thing about Swift Strike. Swift Strike, the best thing about it is that it resets on any elimination. That's not a final blow or a kill, but any elimination that you took part in, anytime you get that little pop-up and that sound effect, that will reset your Swift Strike. So if you damage somebody, Swift Strike and kill them with it, instant reset, you can Swift Strike again and go to somebody else. Or if you're in kind of a bad situation, your Swift Strike is on cooldown, and your teammate kills somebody that you previously hurt, that counts as an elimination, and you can zip right on out of there. This makes it a super spammable ability and makes it very easy to combo with other abilities. Most of the time, good Genjis are going to use it to finish people off. That's what I try to do most of the time, but my estimations on health and healing aren't always perfect, and I do love Swift Striking through big groups of people just to pump up my damage numbers. I'm going to say that getting good with Swift Strike is an essential skill to becoming a better Genji. The Swift Strike probably is more important than your deflect, than your Dragon Blade, than anything else. Getting the timing on this right, understanding the distance, when to use it, when not to use it, how to escape with it, how to finish people off, and getting your resets will definitely separate the men from the boys on this character. Moving on, let's talk about Genji's deflect. It has a total duration of 2 seconds and a cooldown of 8 seconds. The duration time is overall pretty short compared to most channeled abilities, but it's plenty of time to be returning damage to your enemies, and with a cooldown of 8 seconds, it's off of cooldown more often than not, and the cool thing about it is that deflect will bounce back any projectile to the enemy. Pretty much anything they throw at you, you can use deflect and bounce it back, even a lot of things that you wouldn't expect, which we'll cover later, but it's extremely effective. It's your only defensive ability, and given his nature as an offensive character, it's funny that your defensive ability is also offensive. It can be very useful in bouncing back McCree flashbangs and stuns and disruptions and stuff, sleep darts. One thing you do need to note about this is that you have to aim your deflections. It doesn't automatically bounce back into their face. It's going to bounce back wherever your cursor is pointed. This is one of my primary failures as Genji, is that I often lose track of this and just assume it'll go back in the right direction. And interestingly, your deflect will block incoming melee damage from the front. It will not reflect or deflect the incoming melee damage back onto the enemies, but if anybody tries to melee you in the face, that's Torbjorn's hammer, Reinhardt's hammer, an enemy Genji, anything like that, as long as you've got the deflect up and you're facing them, it will completely negate that damage. Now, they can still hit you from the sides and back and top and bottom and stuff, but you can block a surprising amount of melee damage with the deflect. And speaking of that, there are some surprising things that Genji can deflect. He can deflect Reinhardt's fire strikes, he can deflect a portion of Reaper ultimates, he can deflect Mei's icicles, not the freeze, but the icicles. The Symmetra orbs or blobs can be deflected for very large amounts of damage. Zarya's ultimate can be deflected. It's pretty much hilarious when you do this and bounce it back at the enemy team. McCree's flashbangs can be deflected back into his face. You can actually deflect Hanzo's dragons, but only up close. You can only deflect his dragons almost as soon as they're shot. You can't do it at long range. And the Roadhog hook, while isn't technically deflected, it is blocked and will be knocked away, so you can make yourself unhookable for a short period of time. However, there are some things that Genji cannot deflect, like Diva's particle barrier. It's mostly stuff that's beams or electricity, like Winston's Tesla cannon, the Symmetra beam lock-on, Zarya's beam, Mei's freeze gun, Lucio's big area of effect boop. None of these things you can block, and as you'll see later on, most of these things are what counter Genji, because it's just something that he cannot deal with whatsoever, especially in his close quarters combat where he's supposed to excel. Let's talk about Genji's ultimate. The Dragon Blade ultimate will deal 120 damage per swing, which is a lot of damage, we'll say. That is a very significant amount of damage, and it increases your melee range to about 5 meters. With 120 damage per swing, that means that you can 2-hit any DPS or any support that doesn't have additional shielding or armor or heals or anything like that going on. That means that you can 3-hit a lot of the defensive characters or Reaper, because he's got 250 health. And it means that tanks, unfortunately, aren't very good for this. It takes 4, 5, maybe even more hits depending on their healing. So I generally wouldn't recommend using the Dragon Blade on the tanks. I'm kind of a sucker for it because I just like pumping damage into Roadhog just because I can. I would say only go for tanks if they're very exposed exposed or very weak. While you ultimate, you do actually get increased movement speed. It's a slight increase in movement speed, but it is a thing to keep note of, and the duration of this is 6 seconds. You get about 1 swing per second, so overall for your Dragon Blade, you get about 6 swings or just a little bit over 700 damage that you can theoretically pump out. The cool thing about his ultimate is that unlike a lot of the other channeled ultimates in the game, you still have full access to the rest of your kit. You can still do your double jumps, your wall climbs, you can still do your swift strike, you can still do deflect if you want to, and what this means is that comboing your ultimate with swift strike and deflecting all the disables that are coming your way is super important. The smart thing to do with your ultimate, which is not always what I do because I'm not the world's greatest Genji, is to swift strike into a weaker character to deal 50 damage, swing once or twice, finish them off, swift strike away into another person, and the idea is that your team should be helping you, so you should be getting really fast resets on your swift strike, and you should be able to 1 or 2 hit most enemies and bounce around very annoying like. If there's an Ana on the enemy team that wants to sleep dart you, if McCree's going to flashbang you, if there's any sort of disable coming your way, that's when you need to pop your deflect. I very strongly recommend having all of your abilities off of cooldown before using the Genji ultimate because it's most effective that way. And also keep in mind, when you ultimate, you're going to be everybody's #1 target. There's not going to be one person on the enemy team that considers you worth ignoring. You're going to take the entire focus of the team, which means that your team should give a good deal of focus to healing and peeling for you. When it comes to how Genji plays and what I think about him, I think Genji is an amazing DPS character, and he has a super stacked kit, but he requires a lot of skill to play. And he's kind of in a strange way, statistically speaking, because there's a lot of Genjis that will have no medals whatsoever for damage, but then have gold medals for eliminations. Or their statistical spread is a little bit different than somebody like Soldier or Tracer who constantly spams and pumps out DPS. Genji is much more about flanking, harassing healers, and winning 1v1 battles. Genji is a pick kind of character. He isn't great to sit behind Reinhardt's shield and just spam shurikens. That's not what he's made for. He's all about diving the back lines and giving somebody a very, very hard time and kind of peeling and creating an ultimate, not maybe a hard peel, mind you, but sort of a distraction. Genji does offer some utility with his deflect ability, but otherwise isn't a great team player. If your Genji is kind of sticking with the rest of the team, and I don't mean that he's not being a team player, but if Genji's just sitting behind Reinhardt's shield all day, he's not being useful. Genji should be off on his own, slaughtering people for the most part, or at least taking some heat off the rest of your team. When it comes to who Genji is strong against, he's very strong against Bastion for the deflect. He's very strong against Hanzo because he's a difficult target and he can spam Hanzo in the face. Same kind of thing with Junkrat. He can deflect everything right back at him. He's also super good at killing Mercy and Zenyatta because they're overall lower mobility support heroes, and they don't have a lot of peel or sort of self-protection, so you dive in the back lines and slaughter them. There are several characters, however, that are very strong against Genji, most notably Symmetra and Winston. Genji has a very difficult time dealing with Symmetra's beam lock-on, especially if he's got the 275 health with the shield generator. Winston is considered Genji's perfect counter because he's got a ton of health, he's got a shield, he's got armor, and he's just going to constantly cook Genji with the Tesla cannon. Genji can't even really get away because Winston's got jumps too. Zarya can counter Genji mostly because of her bubble to mitigate damage and because her beam can't be deflect. And a brutal, brutal counter to Genji, as she is to most characters, is of course Mei. Genji is going to want to prefer to be close range, and Mei is just going to dominate you in close range with the freeze beam, so you should pretty much completely avoid Mei if you're playing Genji. Guys, that is all for this short episode of In Depth. I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope that you learned something useful. If you did, don't forget to like, favorite, and subscribe. Drifter out.